Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of 2 Thessalonians. Today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark and Sheryl Daughety, and our question comes from chapter 1, of 2 Thessalonians. But since this is the first day of the week, let me talk about the theme briefly. So this is a letter of Paul to the church at Thessalonica. The central theme is living in hope. And Paul writes to address some misunderstandings in the Thessalonian church concerning Christ's return. He encourages them to continue living in the hope of his coming. He reminds them that Christ will return to judge the wicked and bring salvation to those who put their faith in him. He also encourages them to persevere in their faith despite persecution. So our reading today was verses 5 through 12 of chapter 1. And it says, "And God will use this persecution, to show his justice and to make you worthy of his kingdom for which you are suffering. In his justice, he will pay back those who persecute you." The question I want to talk about today is, how does God use persecution to show his justice?
Well, there are multiple ways. One, justice in the sense of I find it interesting. A couple verses in, he says, "I'll pay back your persecutors, those who come against you," and by doing so, demonstrates justice to a degree. You know, it's ironic to me that you have to have injustice in order for justice to come into play on the scene. But he makes a contrast here that appears to be one of the primary reasons, so that God can show himself in that way. You know, then he talks about other things, that how we exemplify Christ by faithfulness and enduring those hardships and persecutions and things. But he, I don't want to say sets us up or allows us to be set up, but we get to a place where he has to step in so his justice can be seen.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, is wanting to see justice happen, because I know people who really struggle seeing people who are very sinful and definitely not holy succeeding in earthly ways, and they want to understand why. You know, why is this person succeeding? Why does it look like it's going better than mine is,
Right.
from the outside? And I think that we do have to remember that God ultimately does have the last hand in what is going to be justified, and what is justice. And I agree with Jay that I was thinking about the very same thing when I was reading this earlier, that it's interesting, and I guess sin is the same way, and holiness. It's interesting for us to think there has to be injustice for us to see what true justice is in God's eyes.
You know, you talked about David said, I look around me and I see all the evil people succeeding. Some of the things that we question like that are a lot more nuanced than just good and evil. For example, God may allow a person that has a generous heart to be successful because he knows they'll help others, whereas someone else that it doesn't have that generous heart, and they may have other flaws. You know, that generous person may have other flaws, problems. And sometimes we do compare our situation to their situation, but we are in our situation. Sometimes it's because of personal choices. Other times it's just, this is God's pathway for us, and we don't have the whole picture.
That's
you
right.
know, the injustice to allow for God's justice to be seen. I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine who is not too far removed from prison, a long stint in prison. And he said to me, I had no preconceptions that I should not go to prison. He said, I believed I should and I would. because I understood that the people who had suffered because of my sin needed to be able to see that God's justice was real, that it wasn't just make believe. It's and that's the thing that sometimes as believers, if your faith is strong, ultimately you can believe in the end, okay, God's going to make everything right. It doesn't make it less comfortable here on this earth. That I don't care what anybody says. It just doesn't.
Less uncomfortable.
Yeah. That less uncomfortable. Having to deal with the persecution or the wrong. But I do think from time to time God's justice has to be carried out in our lifetime for other people to have faith. Because I might be able to, for example, go all of my life and not stress because somebody hasn't paid the price, because I know in the end they will. But other people's faith may not be that strong, and they may need to see God's justice exacted in some instances. And I think we can't explain it because we don't see the whole picture, so we don't always know. But I think there are times that God carries out his justice here on this earth for people to see, so that they can get a boost of hope, that evil doesn't always win out. Sometimes it feels that way. Sometimes it feels that evil always wins. But I believe God allows justice to take place.
And do you think part of that is also to create that contrast?
Yes.
Between what we might see as earthly justice, but what he exacts as his justice. I think we often settle. We often settle for whatever consequences. It's like a jab. The person that you see who is succeeding, but you know how evil they are. And it's like one little small thing here and there might go wrong for them. But then if we see the kind of justice that God has in mind for somebody like that, it may be something very drastic and totally different than what we would be satisfied with.
Sometimes, and this points it out pretty clearly, sometimes what we perceive or label as persecution or suffering actually, as he says here, is to make us worthy of the kingdom because of what we're going through.
Trial by fire.
That's right. And so the quote,
You mean you personally?
the persecution itself may be the instrumental tool that transforms me more into the image of Christ than anything else. And so therefore, the reality is what we perceive as an injustice, God would see as a justice because of the work it's doing in me, if that makes any sense. And I don't think we typically view from that perspective very often.
No, but I think Paul did because he brings it up many times in his letters.
Yeah, he talks about being tried by fire to come forth as pure gold. Here he talks about, being God's glory being brought forth in you. And our justice is so limited anyway, in our understanding,
And our ability to make it happen.
Yes. Well, I had a conversation some time back, and the person was saying, I just want them to pay for what they did. And I was like, they're a miserable human being. They're already paying a horrible price. Like, I mean, how much more of a price can they pay? God's letting them live with themselves. I mean, how much more judgment can you get on them, I mean, because, aren't there some people that it would be the judgment of God if you had to live with them?
Oh. I've heard that.
You mean somebody's used that on you?
Probably. Persecution.
But I think our picture is just so limited. One of what justice really looks like, what the purpose of injustice is, what it's bringing about in us and those people who are around us, what God's trying to show. I just think we miss the point sometimes because sometimes what we call justice is nothing more than revenge. And they're not the same. To you, what's the difference between justice and revenge?
I see revenge more as taking matters into your own hands and trying to administer punishment, whereas justice may include punishment, but it has to do with what is fair and right and balanced. Whereas I think the other is simply revenge. I think it's just trying to exact punishment and hurt and harm. It's a form of retaliation.
Yeah, it almost seems like revenge is like lawlessness. That would be according to a person's opinion for what punishment there needed to be. But I think that justice seems more according to the law, what would be appropriate.
Any other pieces of this passage you want to talk about?
I think it's a challenge for a lot of people to trust that God is going to be sure that justice happens and is done. I've seen, and I know some people who seem to have spent their lives feeling that something has happened to them that they would like revenge for. They do want to see justice happen, and they live under that
bitter
toward
bitterness God,
and
frustrated, angry that why did God allow this to happen? And in the end, as believers, we just have to trust Him. That's what I would say.
Me too.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around 2 Thessalonians.